said, I'm looking forward to sharing my 20-minute view on where IoT has come from, where it currently is, and where it seems to be going, and then trying to round that off with what we believe you can do to get value from it. So some of the things I'd like to cover today are looking at the parallel in IoT between your personal lives and your professional lives. Undoubtedly, one of those two will be more advanced than the other. Then we'll also talk about how IoT is relevant to business life, obviously, with some real-world examples. And thirdly, a few steps with how we believe you can get there and how we've helped our customers get there to date. So working from experience. So just a bit of background, really, I suppose. I'm currently watching the Netflix series Dark. I don't know if any of you have seen it or are watching it. Feel free to type in chat. We can have a little chinwag about that afterwards. But part of it's set in the 80s and the 50s. And I kind of like watching shows like that where the technology is limited. You know, they've got their phones with their cables, and the cars are made out of, you know, great big pieces of steel. The TVs are absolutely massive. There are no flat screens inside. It kind of takes me back to my childhood. And it takes me back to a time when I remember my dad sitting on the phone on a customer call, you know, while he was working. And his customer said to him, asked him to wait because he was waiting for his computer to boot up. My dad took great delight in responding by saying, well, I'm ready with my pencil and paper. I'll never forget his the smile on his face. He was very pleased with not being, you know, trapped by a machine. So he's not exactly what you would call a digitally disrupted person. In fact, digital disruption didn't really even exist at the time, unless the photocopier didn't work for him, and then there was certainly a fair bit of disruption around the place. But anyway, little did we know at the same time, around the 80s, there were a number of university graduate students that were working on a sensory board and connecting it to the ARPANET, which is the precursor to the modern day internet. And they'd done this to monitor the temperature of their nearest Coca-Cola machine, or of the bottles in their nearest Coca-Cola machine. Their premise for doing this was that their office was, quote, a relatively long way from the machine. And by the time they got there, the machine was either empty because of students' voracious appetite for caffeine. I certainly remember that myself. Or they'd just been changed and the bottles were too warm. So they literally monitored the temperature and the availability of their Coke machine. You know, necessity is often called the mother of invention. And this little experiment, or this little project, is largely considered to be the world's first IoT device. So if you haven't heard of that, it's quite a nice little story. I'd recommend, you know, at some point jumping on the internet, having a read of that. It's a nice little story. But since this disruptive technology that started in the 80s, IoT devices have started to fluidly find their way into our consumer lives. In fact, they're so sort of incumbent in our current modern day life that the idea of living without them is probably quite weird and bizarre. We all have connected devices, IoT devices, on our person pretty much at all times. We don't even think about it. There was an article that suggested people reach for their phones when leaving the house before they even reach for their keys, such as their space in our modern world. And, you know, they're always updating, they're always connected, they're always on. And this is obviously under the premise of making our lives easier, you know, updating applications we've downloaded to make things more efficient, to save costs, to monitor our safety, like the COVID app, for example. You know, the adage came about that said there's an app for that. You could literally download anything for any circumstance. And then, of course, there's the feeling of when they don't connect or when they don't work. Rather than just sort of accepting it as a piece of technology that has its issues, we get frustrated. And phones aren't just the only thing. You know, we have doorbells now, for example, that we can answer remotely. Someone's at the door, we're not in, you can answer your phone, you can see who it is, and you can talk to them through the device. fridges that can order groceries. And it's all this sort of stuff is starting to point in towards smart cities. The Australian government, in fact, has committed to a 4-year smart cities plan, where they designed to improve the livability of Australian cities and suburbs using technology. As an example, Liverpool City Council is using a project where they're going to use smartphone detection technology to measure in real time pedestrian and car movements. And then they're going to take that information and make informed decisions about their urban planning and accommodating their population growth as they do that, and what the impacts on mobility are. So they're taking real-time data and they're looking to strategize based on that data. IoT devices that are low cost and low power and have affordable connectivity have literally taken off. They've gone through the roof. The restrictions on the devices used to be the cost of transferring data to the cloud. But now that we have low power, wide area network, cost-effective capability, this barrier to entry has basically been wiped out. In 2017, the low power, wide area network covered 20% of the world's population. So just 3 years ago, 20% of the world population was covered by 20%. The prediction by McKinsey is that by 2022, that coverage will be 100%. Now, somebody somewhere knows that there's going to be a heck of a lot of demand, and they're obviously ramping up for it. In fact, the projections on the growth of the connected devices mirror this. Since 2015, we've seen a doubling in the number of internet connected devices, from 15 billion to over 30 billion today. And that number is forecast to reach 75 billion by 2025. Now, the current population on the planet, I believe, is 7.5 billion. So that, in today's money, equates to about 10 devices per person, which is mind-boggling. I mean, I can imagine 1 or 2 laptops, a couple of phones, maybe a work one and a personal one, a tablet or a smartwatch. But those other 4 devices, I'm not sure even what they look like at the moment. And I'm sure there are people in labs creating the next greatest device. Maybe it's going to be something similar to monitor the temperature of Coke machines, but who knows what it looks like, but it's definitely on the horizon. Interestingly, though, despite these numbers, it seems to be a generally held consensus that IoT is actually just at the beginning of its revolution. It's in its infancy. Even though we have the ability to easily capture, store, and analyze vast amounts of data, and it's totally affordable, and you can get 24/7 monitoring on your chosen assets, the challenge really comes in that you need to get value from that insight. And arguably, in this forum, at the very least, I believe that the highest form of value we could aim for would be to join the dots between organizational objectives and asset management objectives. Now, hopefully, this isn't how you all are feeling right now, but there's an example of a customer or a company that I know of that used IoT devices, or using IoT devices and data. They recognized and realized that they had higher than expected levels of CO2 in their workspaces in the morning. Now, as we all know, CO2 normally builds up when there have been a number of people in an unventilated space, and CO2 can cause drowsiness and inefficiency, potentially risk, like this young lady in the image here. So that business was confused as to why the CO2 levels were so high in the morning before anyone had even arrived. So using IoT and the data that they had, they began to investigate, and they found that the cleaners in the morning were coming in, doing the cleaning, and then turning on gas heaters to make the room more comfortable for staff. This in turn inadvertently increased the CO2 levels. A simple mistake to make, and probably something that's been done since the dawn of gas heating. But if you don't know that that's the knock-on effect, you can't act and you can't make improvements. And you certainly can't look at this kind of thing and think somebody's to blame for that, because that's one of the values of IT, is showing you things you didn't understand or you didn't know were there. And we found at AssetFuture that through working with our customers, that sometimes insights from IoT confirm the hunches that they have, sometimes they disprove them, and other times it does just this. It points to areas that weren't even on your radar. That's the true power. Discovering the undiscovered. Unfortunately, it can be confronting, And there's definitely a level of organizational maturity required when you're looking under the covers at these kind of things. There's no blame to be thrown around. It is data, and it is information with which you can act. And then you have to try and connect those dots to make the changes. But how do you connect them in a way that's actually beneficial to your organization, in a way that's meaningful? Having a look at the ISO 55000 suite of documents, the Strategic Asset Management Plan is cited to be a document information that specifies how organizational objectives are to be converted into asset management objectives. To my mind, this is quintessentially connecting the dots. You're looking at converting something from an organizational objective into an asset management objective. But I think it's interesting they use the word how, especially when we're talking about strategy. So let's just dive into that a little bit, take it apart a bit. There's a quote I like that says, people often confuse strategy with plans. And if after this session you go away with that in the back of your mind and watch people talk about plans and strategy, you might come to recognize that as a truth. If we define a strategy as a framework for making decisions, and we define a plan as telling you what needs to be done, by when and by whom, then a strategic plan would be a high-level, long-term document that describes what needs to be done, but not how to do it. So I think of the Strategic Asset Management Plan as a link, an API, a conduit between business and operations. And on that level, I'm definitely more interested in how IoT informs a long-term strategy rather than short-term plans. I mean, it's common knowledge before coming onto this session, it's probably even common practice, that you would know IoT data could be used as the primary source of asset performance, if you consider it in the form of determining whether an asset is fit for purpose. That is to say, you have objective data based on what the asset is designed to do. So you use a bit of IoT widget, you put it on an asset, you monitor that asset, and if something happens to that asset that's outside of what's considered normal, i.e. vibration and heat, an alert is triggered and then someone goes out to fix it. You see, this is an operational benefit. Something alerts us is not working and we react. And by that virtue of that fact, you're still waiting for something to happen before you react. So it's still kind of reactive maintenance. It's, I suppose you could call it proactive reactive maintenance, for want of other phrase. So how do we get to strategic Internet of Things within asset management? What does it even look like? I mean, could you use IoT to inform your facilities condition index? What if the true utilization of an asset would it enable you to forecast its condition and inform you on a review of your maintenance strategies? Maybe you're over-servicing or under-servicing an asset class in complete contradiction to your expectations. Over-servicing obviously can save you costs if you can bring it down, and under-servicing obviously exposes risk, so you might need to bring it up. If you monitored multiple assets at the same time to see how often those assets went outside the norm, could you change your strategy accordingly to those assets too? Maybe even renegotiate service levels with vendors if that asset's not operating as it's been designed or sold to you, and you've got the data to back you up in those situations. The fact that you've had to wait until the asset is showing abnormal signs as well doesn't actually mean that you're not going to have to take it offline to look at it, which means there's still potential downtime issues. So based on true utilization, the Internet of Things, the data from the Internet of Things can inform your decisions on whether to maintain an asset, upgrade it, divest it, or acquire altogether new assets. Some of those decisions that a lot of you are probably going through quite vigorously right now in COVID times. Effective use of the data as well will help you inform your current strategic asset management plan and your future plans. By using benchmarking, you can decide or notify whether or not you've made the right decisions by going down path A, B, or C. And as soon as you make that recognition, you can reinform your strategy. You can create an iterative improvement cycle, a sort of feedback loop. And this feedback loop can talk to all business functions because it's data-driven. It will break down silos and it will drive alignment. It will create a universal language, if you will. A colleague of mine in our data team said something the other day, or month, or year, I lose track of time being stuck in this house, that really resonated with me. He said, opinions drive division and facts drive alignment. So evidence-based strategic decision-making will be the result of truly using IoT data as a driver of your strategy. So we'll have a quick look at some of the operational benefits. And they are probably what you would expect, like notification of device failure we spoke about earlier. There's a Swiss company called ABB who has wired all of their tunnel drilling machines for preventative maintenance. They've saved their end users millions of dollars in unplanned downtime. Automation of maintenance and repair operations through over-the-air diagnosis and repair. Farming customers of the heavy machinery company John Deere, for example, utilize remote connections so their dealers can diagnose and fix machine malfunction without actually needing to go on site, using real-time data and remote visualization. Again, that has reduced downtime and maintenance costs. But arguably these are operational benefits. But what about the strategic benefits? Let's build this out. If we're looking at this strategically, I think you should expect to see a forecastable budget that's focusing on high impact work that can drive increased business growth. I mean, after all, what are assets but the backbone of a business, where value creation is the primary driver of asset management. Without those assets, the business ostensibly couldn't achieve the outcomes it's trying to achieve. And then you can benchmark across those asset types while you trial and test various ideas or concepts and theories. When you figure the one that's right, you can determine the optimal approach and then change your strategy and roll out that benefit across the whole business. And I don't know if anyone here on the call struggles to get other people across the line because they've got a different agenda to you. I mean, I know I certainly do and have historically, but breaking down silos using data, you can drive internal alignment, this universal language to connect all stakeholders. And so while I've attempted to define a strategy and define a plan, and I've tried to clarify the purpose of the strategic asset management plan in terms of the business communicating with operations and vice versa through this universal language, it does seem that the whole process is, intrinsically linked, and it's definitely not separate or disparate. The data seems to inform the operations inform the plan in turn informs the strategy, and the strategy helps you adjust what you do across the business based on the trends highlighted by that real data, real time, captured in the field. As an example of this, another colleague of mine, earlier this year spoke at AM Speak. And they were talking about how we work with IoT at the New South Wales Education, New South Wales schools. We've been running a pilot with them in 2 schools across New South Wales in various different classrooms, libraries and common areas. I've got a case study on this if anyone is interested. And we were measuring general data such as CO2, temperature, humidity, movement, like that kind of stuff, to get an idea of what a comfortable room is or a comfortable learning environment would look like. And then again, modeling that learning environment so it can be replicated and rolled out. What does an old architecture look like versus a new architecture, that kind of thing. And when we look at this real-time data, we, AssetFuture, created mathematical modeling that simulated the degradation models based on the true utilization of those assets. And the insights that we've found have driven iterative change in modeling for long-term strategic decision-making within education. But if you look beyond that and you consider the massive reduction of utilization of office buildings and retail units over the last 6 months, the simple ability to understand what that true degradation based on live utilization data looks like, to be able to help you understand what your maintenance strategies and capital budgets, i.e. fix, replace, repurpose, or mothball that facility, can look like, while still being aligned to the risk appetite of your business. I mean, the value is really quite significant, and to be able to do it in a timely fashion, it just makes that value even more exponentially significant. Not to mention the fact that it's data-driven, as we've mentioned, and so that universal language will help the business and operations understand and work together toward a unified agenda. As promised, we're going to have a quick, wrong way. We're going to have a quick look at some ways that we think we can get started on this journey. Try to draw some parallels between your personal lives and your professional lives, again, within IoT. But again, think about in your personal life, you've all got mobile phones and you all, I presume, take photographs. And there'll probably be a number of you that have decided you don't want to store your photos on your device, you want to have them in the cloud. So you've chosen a photo storage, Google Photos, iPhotos, whatever it may be, and then you started to sync those to the cloud. Each time you take a photo, it gets stored up there, so whatever happens to the device doesn't matter. Your memories are stored and they're safe and they're sacred. That kind of mindset is the same mindset that is needed in order to extrapolate into the business, right? So the first step you need to do is to create a data management plan. You need, in the case of the photos, you've chosen which cloud storage facility to use. So you need to create a data management plan. For that, you need ownership. You need someone who has oversight and management of a plan. They need to be able to take input from stakeholders, and they need to design a data management plan that specifies the operational constraints and the business drivers to get the buy-in across the board. And it needs to drive consistency, like having a structured hierarchy or location data, condition values, etc., in a standardized framework. This consistency is really important. If you say that a critical asset is in condition 5, everybody needs to know what critical means, and everybody needs to know what condition 5 means. If people are using their own interpretations and inputting their own thought processes, you're going to end up with a garbage in and garbage out scenario, which is not uncommon, but it really is highly undesirable. It's harder to undo than it is to prevent. Like with the photos, for example, you'll probably take 10 photos or 10 selfies. I know there are those types of you on there, and then you'll delete 9 of them and keep the best one. Use that as your new LinkedIn profile pic. The second step is to centralize existing data, right? So you've chosen the platform and then you upload all of your photos into the cloud. Within business, this is in fact one of the hardest and most time-consuming steps. I mean, you've probably, if you think about it, you've probably got data all over the place at the moment within your current workspace. And centralizing it is very likely to be a manual process in the beginning. As new data is gathered and existing data is cleaned up, and you realize that there are gaps in the data, so you have to enrich that data with complementary information. You've probably still got paper-based information that needs to be digitized. Some assets might not be networked, so you have to add some asset tags like barcodes or QR codes, etc., for easier scanning with mobile devices. Ultimately, this process will become automated or should become automated, and if not, at the very least, part of your business process to drive that consistency across the business once again. Ultimately, new devices should have identification information embedded in them, and that will help you keep up to date by the OEM service provider and keep the asset management and asset register up to date. And then, just like the ever updating devices in our pockets, those devices will be able to autonomously push data to your asset management platform, so you can maintain the data and lead to step 3, which is maintaining the data as a valuable asset. Buildings and infrastructure are rightly regarded, in fact, as highly valuable assets. I mean, that is, after all, the reason we're all here. They're treated, or should be treated, with scrupulous attention to what happens across their usable life. Whereas, for some reason, and we're coming over the crest of the hill on this, the data about these assets is often treated haphazardly, despite its high value. Thinking back to your current silos and the data that's probably still on paper and has gaps in it. If businesses with large and often geographically dispersed teams as well, ownership of this data can fall into silos and fall into multiple business units, and that consistency can fall by the wayside. A lack of an holistic view can lead to issues falling through cracks, which in turn reduces the value of that data to the business and, of course, increases risk. So you have to ask yourself why the data is not treated as a valuable in and of itself. I mean, ultimately, this data does degrade, just like the facilities that the data is about degrades. The unfortunate thing is, of course, that this data degrades much more rapidly than the building, so you really do need to stay on top of it. Again, like your photos, keeping them in the cloud, and then looking back on them in years to come. You know, it's a valuable data is a valuable asset. And then you've got to consider the ownership of that data. Who retains it from a cost and decision perspective? Ultimately, all of these things we've spoken about are new in their concept. Like I said, IoT is considered to be in its infancy, despite all of the data and information that's available to us. And it's a journey that many organizations will need to be led through. So just to summarize, you know, we've gone through this and looked at it as how it's been a part of your personal life now, and how to take that mindset and shift it into your working life, how to borrow from businesses that are already doing it. There are a lot of use cases and scenarios out there that you can essentially beg, borrow, steal from. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And then a few steps on how to get there, and make sure you go iteratively. Fail fast, fail forward, as they say in the innovation space. Don't be afraid of failure. Don't be afraid of what's under the covers. Just take the data, find the information, and take the best path that you know what to do with. And the only true barrier to innovation in these scenarios really is your own imagination. So you have to ask yourself, where might your imagination take you? Thank you very much.